Greetings and salutations. I am Eurosion, and I present a curious topic of discussion for you today. Have you ever felt that history taught in schools seems a bit too simplistic and as if something been left out? Ask many people anything about history, and you'll commonly find this undertone of we were bad and oppressive in the past, but we are now good and free. This narrative is harmful for intellectual discussion of history. It can be misleading for history. For instance, it leads to widespread misconceptions like the idea that the Middle Ages was nothing but a dark backward time devoid of progress or enlightenment. In extreme cases, people can treat as civilization only really became modern after the 1950s, and this would just ignore centuries of innovation, resilience, and human achievement. While it is important to recognize past wrongs, we must also be cautious not to erase the complexity of historical eras or dismiss the people who lived in them. To reduce history to a simple moral arc, bad then, good now, is not only inaccurate, but intellectually and ethically lazy. The root cause of this oversimplified understanding of the past lies in the widespread adoption of Whig history. This historical perspective was most notably advanced by Thomas Baddington Macaulay. He frames history as a linear progression from ignorance and oppression towards enlightenment and freedom. As Macaulay himself wrote, the history of our country during the last 160 years is eminently the history of physical, moral, and of intellectual improvement. While this view may offer a comforting narrative, it often distorts the complexity of the past to a mere prelude to the present. In essence, Whig history teaches us all previous eras were stepping stones to our modern greatness. Perspective I would summarize as cynically as history is a path from our oppressive past to our glorious future. This lens, I argue, betrays intellectual engagement with the past by favoring moral judgments over historical understanding, and that is why Whig history is my greatest enemy. So, let's dive into a brief description of the history of Whig history. Although Whig history eventually spread in influence, it was initially developed to interpret British history by taking its name from the British liberal faction, the Whigs. At its core, Whig history presents British history as a steady and inevitable evolution toward liberty and constitutionalism and parliamentary governance, values supposedly nurtured by the Whig aristocracy over time. As historian Michael Bentley observes, this view emphasizes the continuity of institutions and practices since Anglo-Saxon times that lent to English history to a special pedigree, one instilled by a distinct temper in the English nation, and lent a legal precedent and a role of preserving and extending the freedoms of Englishmen. This framework, commonly echoed at the time, promoted a pseudo-nationalistic portrayal of the English identity, often contrasting it with the so-called foreign tyranny of other dynasties, particularly the Stuarts. It framed the English culture as inherently a liberal and freedom-loving one, while portraying Scottish and French-influenced monarchies as despotic intrusions. One early Whig historian, Paul de Rapon, exemplifies this attitude by claiming the English had preserved their ancient constitution against the absolutist tendencies of the Stuarts, thereby positioning the Stuarts as a uniquely oppressive force, even more so than some of their predecessors or successors. The philosopher and historian David Hume directly challenged Whig interpretations of history in his book The History of Great Britain, which encompassed England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. In contrast to the Whig portrayal of James II as a tyrant intent on absolute monarchy, Hume argued that these claims are exaggerated and rooted in deep political bias. According to Whig, James II sought to undermine English sovereignty by playing the Scottish and English parliaments off against each other in a bid for absolute power. They often accused him of being a Catholic sympathizer who aimed to suppress Protestant liberties and dissolve constitutional limits. Hume presented a more nuanced view. He observes that monarchy and the ascension of the House of Stuart was possessed by an extensive authority founded merely on the opinion of the people, influenced by an ancient precedent and an example. This suggests that James II's actions were actually in line with the expectations and norms of the time, and even the past before him, rather than indicative of a unique tyrannical ambition. He pointed out that James's primary political aim was the unification of England and Scotland to a single entity, the Kingdom of Great Britain, rather than effort to subjugate one or the other. If anything, James's policies were more repressive in Scotland, where he prosecuted religious dissidents such as Puritans. Far from being universally hostile to English institutions, Hume portrayed James as attempting to navigate a competing religious and political tensions. He was much more than just a straightforward despot. Another monarch misrepresented by Whig historians is Charles I, arguably one of the more misunderstood figures in British history. Whig historians often depict them as a symbol of absolutist oppression, but this view lacks crucial historical context. During the Tudor era, monarchs such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I had already established the precedent that royal authority could operate independently of the Parliament. They levied taxes and raised troops under the doctrine of divine right. While this was controversial, it was not unprecedented and has existed for a while now. These actions sowed, however, a long-standing fear of absolutism among later political thinkers, particularly the subject of this video, the Whigs, who sought to limit royal authority. Many of them were influenced by Puritan ideas and were deeply suspicious of divine right monarchs. This distrust only intensified by the memory of Queen Mary I's prosecution of Protestants, many of whom were Puritan. This further solidified a desire of a Calvinist Protestant monarch who favored decentralized religious and political structure. In contrast, Charles I supported High Church Anglicanism, which shared features with Catholicism, and upheld a centralized church authority. This clashed directly with the Presbyterian and Puritan-leaning members of Parliament who favored a more decentralized church. As David Hume would observe, the Parliament assumed an authority entirely incompatible with the monarch. Charles I found it incredibly difficult to cooperate with the Parliament that questioned the very foundation of his rule. Eventually, this breakdown led him to bypass the Parliament altogether, used through royal prerogative. Hume again would summarize this conflict succinctly as the Commons were seduced by the most absurd notions of liberty, while the king maintained an ancient constitution. Despite its historical inaccuracies, Whig history was eagerly adopted by many early liberal thinkers, as it supported a narrative of inevitable progress, civil liberty, and resistance to tyranny. Philosophers like John Locke, while not being a Whig historian themselves, provided intellectual foundations that later Whig historians would use to reinforce their arguments, by portraying the Stuarts, and more radical accounts, even the Tudors, as despotic monarchs, who sought to extinguish the alleged ancient tradition of English liberty. Whig thinkers constructed a moralistic narrative of the past tailored to justify their own liberal views of their own time. However, this portrayal distorts the realities of monarchical rule. The Tudors and Stuarts, far from being tyrants in their own guard, largely governed consistently with their predecessors and successors. The supposed timeless English liberties were not always present or protected as the Whigs suggest. Perhaps they were even entirely fictional. Much of the historical framing was done by Puritan and liberal ideologies, which during Hume's time were still far from dominant, particularly in Britain, where more conservative interpretations of monarchy and order still hold sway. You're probably saying, oh, well, that's all nice and all, but how does this political dispute play back into Whig history? The reason this plays back into Whig history is because the English Civil War had a lot of these proto-liberal ideas, which were a hotbed in these non-Anglican Protestants, who were still left in England at the time, especially after Cromwell, who was one of the people who subscribed to Puritanism and some of these proto-liberal ideas, which, as stated prior, Puritanism and these liberal ideas were shared amongst Whigs, who opposed these traditional Anglicanist values and absolutist values that the Stuarts and majority of the population subscribed to. Cromwell, just like the Whigs, opposed monarchy for religious and political reasons. Because of this, a lot of the Whigs in the 1700s tried to claim him as a party member and a role model to base their new enlightenment off of, to further limit the power of the monarchy during this time and justify liberalism, as well as juxtapose him to the monarchies before him, to make the monarchies before him look evil and from the past, and have Cromwell as a sign of future and inevitable progression. Whig history and liberal ideology, though developing in Europe and Britain during the Enlightenment, didn't really gain broad traction until after the American Revolution. The founding of the United States offered tangible proof to liberals and dissenting Protestants, especially those of Puritan heritage, that a society can actually be built on constitutionalism and religious pluralism, as well as anti-monarchical values. Many of these early American colonies, particularly in New England, were founded by Puritan merchants and fleeing Christian minorities, fleeing, well, religious persecution like under Mary I. These colonists carried with them not only dissenting theological convictions, but also deeply ingrained suspicion of centralized royal authority. Over time, these communities became a fertile hotbed for these liberal ideas that were often met with skepticism in Europe. This ideological rift between the Anglican monarchy and the Puritan-influenced colonies deepened after the Seven Years' War, Britain having spending vast sums defending the colonies imposed taxes predominantly on businesses, rather than civilians to recuperate its losses. But many of the merchants in the colonies felt that this was an overreach of authority, echoing fears that had driven their ancestors to migrate. The growing alienation between Parliament and the colonies, much like the earlier conflict between Charles I and the hostile Whig Parliament, set a stage for open rebellion. The American Revolution thus became, in part, an old reenactment of the Old English conflict, though only this time it was fought on a new soil and with even more disastrous consequences for the global scene. The Whig historical lens, with its anti-absolutism and its pro-parliamentarian themes, resonated deeply with American colonies, particularly among the merchant and Puritan descendant communities. As tensions grew after the Seven Years' War, the British Parliament intended to recover wartime expenses through a series of taxes and duties on colonial trade, which affected particularly businesses and merchants. As a fair contribution from the colonies, these taxes were viewed in America as illegitimate, imposed without representation and threatening economic autonomy. Colonial elites, especially merchants and businesses, feared that the tightening of regulation would erode their profits and freedoms. Their response was by invoking this language of rights and liberty, language influenced by the Whig and Enlightenment thought. These ideas kind of trickled down to the broader public, stoking fears of Britain intending to enslave or economically strangle the colonies. This resulted in a culmination of protests, like the Boston Tea Party, where demonstrators destroyed West India Company property in symbolic defiance. Parliament responded with punitive measures. The Coercive Acts, which only further alienated the colonists. Tensions escalated into open rebellion and eventually revolution. King George III repealed several of these laws, but insisted on retaining at least one tax law on the American colonies to uphold Parliament's authority, but the US was insistent on revolution. After the American victory, the success of the Republic, founded on these aforementioned liberal and anti-monarchical principles, galvanized reformist movements across Atlantic. In France, many merchants, elites, and intellectuals saw the American experiment as a model for their own grievances, and soon the French Revolution followed after the American Revolution. Though initially national in scope, liberal ideology, rooted in Whig interpretations of history, was carried across Europe by Napoleon's conquests. Ironically, while Napoleon was an emperor, he also exported many of these Enlightenment liberal principles: codified law, secular governments, dismantling aristocratic privilege. As a result of this, what began as specifically an English narrative of liberty evolved into a broader transitional movement of constitutional governments and individual rights. It was only after this that Hume's historical narrative was dropped in favor of Thomas Baddington Macaulay's, who, as said prior, was a Whig historian. So now that you understand how Whig history survived and spread through liberal thought, we can now begin to discuss about why it's bad for serious historical discussion. As shown before using Stuarts, after times important historical narrative and details are dropped in favor of pushing a narrative of the past being this barbaric time that paved the way for a prosperous future. Another good example of how Whig history poisoned the well of historical discussion is the Middle Ages, which starts from 476 CE and ends in about 1500 CE. Whig history portrays this little over 1,000-year period as if it had absolutely no progress and was highlighted by oppression and lack of innovation. This common belief is so laughable, you only need to name a few things to disprove it. For example, the discovery of the New World, the rediscovery of ancient Greek thought, the establishment of universities and schools, the founding of early modern engineering, finding the circumference of the Earth, disproving flat Earth, diagnosis of the stroke, early modern medicine, early modern surgery, and many more could just be named in the innovation department because there was just so many in this 1,000-year period. Medieval kings weren't as oppressive as Whig history portrays them either. In fact, the first constitutions were drafted in the Middle Ages, like the Domesday Books, the Cortes, the Estates Generales, the Magna Carta, and slavery is also outlawed in this time as well, given you were a Christian, at least. Medieval kings lived in fear of clergy, political opponents, and nobility, as well as the people themselves. It was a very difficult interpersonal game that they had to ensure to not be overthrown and keep their power and position as the, head of state. They had to pass laws to please the people, the clergy, the nobility, and this is why, during this time, the position of king was a very precarious one. There really wasn't a thing like absolute monarchism way until the 1600s and into the Enlightenment. History is, at the end of the day, just another form of propaganda. It's revisionist history crafted to support liberal regimes, just like socialist revisionism served to aim the needs of socialist regimes. Both use selective narratives to justify their ideological authority. But Whig history remains especially pervasive among the modern world because it aligns with the liberal democracies, positioning their existence as an inevitable outcome of human progress. So, how do you combat this? I'm open to suggestions, so please take this effort to leave a comment below. I think we need a joint effort, personally founded on critical thinking and historical empathy. This is essential. We must begin by understanding norms, superstitions, social structures, and intellectual limitations of past societies, and to see the world as how they saw it. A core failure of Whig history is its tendency to judge the past through modern morality, resulting in the distorted and oversimplified narrative of history. For example, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is frequently vilified in modern discourse for marrying a 6-year-old, a practice that, while understandably make us uncomfortable now, was not uncommon in a world where few people lived past teenage years. This was a different universe shaped by survival, alliance, and lineage, not by modern notions of childhood. Those would come after the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, historical figures often held views about other groups reflected by their limited knowledge and superstitions at the time. That wouldn't necessarily make them evil either, just racist. Business alliances were often done through marriage, is another common thing that they did back in the past. Another common thing that they did back in the past was non-romantic bed sharing between men. These were normalized social behaviors back in their time, and they had completely different meanings than they would today. A fault not necessarily of Whig history, but more so the way that history is taught in schools, is the focus on one's own nation history. This isn't bad. In fact, it's great to have an understanding of one's own country. The problem is how Whig history preys on this. Whig history being this cynical, hateful look at this supposed barbaric past causes people to view their own nation as evil and hate their own nation, their own culture, and their own national heroes, and their own founders. This is bad in of itself, but in some instances, like with the nukes of Japan, it could cause rather interesting results, such as the victimization of Japan, a narrative that is dangerous because people who ignore the blatant and horrendous war crimes done by Japan to save face for this narrative of victimhood that Japan is supposed to have. By ignoring these distinctions, Whig history turns nearly every figure of the past into a villain, reducing their complexity into just a caricature. Its simplified moral binary distorts rather than enlightens, which is what it seeks to do. Figures not evaluated within the structures of their own time, but rather are arbitrary moral ideals. The result is a sense of moral superiority that feels good. However, it really doesn't teach anything important. It discourages us from asking harder questions. Why did people believe this? Why did they act like this? Why did they do it? What was the way they did it? What would we have done in their position? Not to mention, it'd be hard to support any historical figure because basically everybody's done something in history that would we probably view as morally wrong in the modern era. To counteract Whig history, we must simply relearn how to read the past, not as a primitive prologue to the present, though this requires historical empathy, not to excuse the actions, but understand the motives behind them. It requires dismantling the linear view of progress, the one that paints history as a dark tunnel we've been triumphing through to emerge from. Instead, we should recognize history as a landscape of competing ideas, failures, and adaptations, where many paths were possible and none were guaranteed. Ultimately, serious historical discussion may move beyond just modernist moralism. Whig history falsely presents liberal democracy and individuals' rights as natural, destined to come of human development. Ironically, even Marxist thought inherits this structure, claiming that socialism and communism is the inevitable endpoints of liberalism. In both cases, history just becomes a ladder. Every previous era is just judged by how high you can climb. But history isn't lacking. It's a tangle of roots, interconnected and diverse, shaped by human frailty. The anecdote to Whig history is not cynicism, but discipline. We must resist the temptation to use the past as a mirror for present desires. Instead, we must seek to understand it to its fullest and most uncomfortable complexity. Only then can we begin to recover from the truth of ideological distortion. Thank you for paying me some time, my dear interlocutors. This is Yerosian, and I would like to wish you all a